I'd like to start my little talk with a sort of peer at perhaps why this terrain of healthcare is so skewed, and that's why psychologists and psychiatrists aren't learning about the chakras and the meridians in the first place, and why we're having to have this sort of coming together now, this sort of functional, integrative time. But part of the reason is because things are a little bit hidden. You know, the information has a sense of being a double-edged sword. But in this particular case, with the slide we're looking at, it really is about irony, I think. And that little yin yang, I know he's slightly sideways for many perhaps, but it's a cartouche. It's a graffiti created with the color black on a white background, or white would also be added. But the cartoon in 2 dimensions is of our nature, who we are, and the other diagrams to the side of it try and explain that, because ultimately the dots are referring to the top and bottom of a toroidal geometrical experience. But on a 2-dimensional wall or piece of paper a few hundred years ago, it looks like a yin yang. And I find this a very interesting point, because there's a real sense in people around the world, forget science, forget industry, just people generally have this sense of being betrayed by duality and needing to see more meaning and purpose in everything. And I think the opening of the yin yang allows us to do that. I also wanted to speak, you know, in this initial phase of how ironic things are. For many of you who are medically trained, you'll be very familiar, perhaps not with this particular cover of Gray's Anatomy, which has been for many years the standard book of anatomy and physiology. But it is ironic that there is no allusion to, for example, the meridian system, the nadi system. They're the same thing, but from 2 different, very ancient traditions, but not included in the Western perspective of anatomy. But then along came this fabulous fellow, Alex Gray, E rather than A, and sort of filled in the blanks. And I hope some of you are chuckling because you're aware of this fabulous book, Sacred Mirrors, and how he was able to transcend through all the sort of viscera, the skeleton, all the different systems of the body, and then seamlessly into a particular image which lets us see all the meridians, the nadis, the acupuncture points, the chakras, all in the same picture. So this sense of divergence between traditional Oriental medicine and Vedic science is actually just an illusion. So this conversation that I'm having with you is about this, is that, you know, we don't end at our skin. And as we've spoken earlier, we've had to wait. Certainly colleagues around the world have been using pendulums and divining rods and all kinds of other devices, tuning forks, to measure within this fields emanating from the being. But until science can stick a microscope or really see something, observe something, it doesn't have much credibility. And of course, that's very ironic, because we also know that the observer influences the results of his observations. So science itself is already stuck in a bit of a loop there. But do keep this image in mind as I speak this morning. It's this morning here in Mexico. And as we dance through who am I would like you to have this toroidal image in mind. And there is Alex Gray's images that I was speaking to. But essentially, my subject, my science, has been studying what we really know to be the fourth state of matter. And I find it quite amazing that it's been not just hidden from science, but taboo in most environments. I mean, in school, we learn about ice and water and steam, and we may have some insight into sort of ionized, fast rushing, the fourth state of matter, but there isn't really a journey into it. And I think obviously there are lots of reasons why. And I'm glad that there's lots of scientists around the world who've been funded independently, who've been outside of the university system, that really has had this kind of taboo up. So here we are, I mean, looking at the plasma, bioplasma emanating from a fingertip. And it is interesting, of course, that it emanates from the fingerprint. And so when someone is sort of presented as being uniquely individualized, it's fascinating that it's the sort of exhaust equipment of the plasma that creates that individualization. But equally, if someone was reading your palm, for example, which in many areas is well understood, this is effectively the skeletal structure of the bioplasma, and therefore potentially that aspect of us which lives beyond each life, you could say. So very kindly, colleague Karina earlier mentioned biofield science, and then our hostess, the mostess, has now bigged me up. But the fact is, there's been a long history of scientists whose shoulders I stand on, sit on, wash their feet sometimes. But the point is that, yes, convergence, sort of point of singularity for relevance for a non-invasive technology, which anyone can use and observe their state of wellness, not just on a physical level, as in, as I said, the systems of the body, the skeletal, the digestive, the cardiovascular systems, from an energetic perspective, of course, from this biophotonic, bioplasmic perspective, but also importantly, that understanding perhaps of one's emotional state and other aspects of self that make up the individual. And Susan earlier spoke to how many millions of people we've scanned. Well, certainly we've got thousands of colleagues, and absolutely millions of people have had biofield images taken by now, I would have thought, especially now that we have this free portal open to anyone with any phone or any technology, as I said, to access it. And I'm going to give you that link towards the end of my talk. But in reference to Kundalini, I think, it is important to know that normally individuals have a range of patterns and symmetry when they're healthy, like this man. There's few issues, perhaps on the right side of his jaw. He has some kind of dental issues, and there is some concern there in the throat, the energy we associate with the throat chakra, but essentially a very symmetrical and bright field. But the point is that every once in a while we get these individuals who show up, in a very divine state. And, I think the equation is very simple, that, we can compare the Kundalini experience from a sort of baseline of normal, where she's coiled and relaxed and now kind of about to go on stage and do a drumming circle with a whole load of turned on individuals at full moon. And suddenly you're kind of, and of course, white has all the colors in it. So if I was a Healy, in spite of his own personal issues this fellow has got, I can draw from this light. That's the point about healing. If someone has abundance, then others, especially if they're offering it, can receive this abundance of light. And I would be happy to say at this point that to define Kundalini from my perspective, perhaps not scientifically, but certainly from my readings, Kundalini equals light equals consciousness. And it's the same thing that Christopher Hill's in his fabulous book, Nuclear Evolution, wrote, and I stand beside him to make it that simple. You know, light, consciousness, Kundalini, absolutely the same thing. And you know, we have so many stories about our biofield, whether it's Joseph and his Technicolor dream state, and so much form that allude to it. This is a fabulous camera developed by Valerie Hunt, bless her soul, a brilliant scientist in California. And again, you could argue we're watching a Kundalini experience. As this lady starts humming, she's obviously totally in tune with herself anyway. And again, interestingly, in the lotus position, the child is getting a great delight too, and very powerful stuff. Takes your breath away, really. So from our perspective, what we've developed a technology, which is kind of a system, very inexpensive system, which allows healers, any kind of practitioner, to kind of work with the lights on, you could say. And you'll notice that we've got this gentleman on a massage table. And so what we're effectively doing is filming this gentleman's biofield live, but projecting it straight back onto him as well. And he's also having a treatment, which you can hear in the background with certain sounds and notes. But because of the projector, we get a kind of dimensionality to the biofield, which makes it incredibly accurate. And you can see as we travel down towards his midriff, there's lots of pools of pink there, and some of the darker patterns, asymmetries there in the torso. And that's an emotional dimension that we can speak to, and maybe he can digest that asymmetry by facing it. And some fabulous precision healing, then we're in a different age now where everyone can see what's going on, and then there's no kind of smoke and mirrors. And also scientific community can't say, well, actually, this is all poo-poo, because everyone can gather around as they did of old, and as some university medical schools still do, the operating theatre, and they can watch what's going on. So when scientists or especially medical leaders poo-poo pendulums and divining rods, well, maybe they have a point because they don't understand how these sensitive measuring devices work. But when you actually present it in the form of the same kind of technology they use all the time, a kind of scanner that's independently developed and can be tested in different ways against baselines and temperature and all these other different things to show what it really is doing, then I think we're in a strong position to have this integration that we've all been promising you for the last 20 or 30 years. But again, who am I? Who am I? Well, I'm glad that the word chakra has been mentioned a few times today. I'm going to have to get my clock right beside me because this is what I'm going to talk about in a sense right now. But I'm going to sort of simplify it and not even use necessarily the word chakra at all, because we have this point right at the very bottom of us, between our legs, if you like, perineum, it is where this vortex from the toroidal field that I spoke to you about emanates from. This part of the body in Vedic science and in Oriental medicine is associated with grounding. In our understanding, we talk about flight, fight, and freeze. Well, I drive on a mountain road a mile up and I literally can go petrified, like to stone. So I get what freeze is. And of course, flight is when you're running the heck away from the woolly mammoth, and fight is when you have your mates with you and a couple of bow and arrows, and so you're running the heck towards it. It's going to be the village dinner for the next winter, so you've got to catch that guy. And that's all the base chakra. The legs, well, they do the flighting and fighting, don't they? And the freezing. But interestingly, in terms of Christian or other myths, other religious perspectives, this chakra, this zone, if you like, I'm trying not to say the word chakra, it's associated with anger, as in the 7 deadly sins. If you look them up, I think I've got this slide at the end of this little bit, so we can actually see the colors of the deadly sins. So the Christians were trying to obviously create parables to describe things, and I think that was what they used to describe this that I'm talking about. But anyhow, the top of this slide says first dimension, and so what I'm suggesting is that the chakras, or this vortex that we're describing, they're rather like gyroscopes. Let's think we're standing on a ball. It's 24,000 miles around, and it goes around once a day, so that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. I'm standing on a ball that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, but hey presto, I feel like I'm still. That stillness, that sense of stillness, is given to us because of this bioplasmic equipment, a bit like a space station firing a plasma jet to kind of self-right itself. This is all subconsciously going on. But what I'm suggesting is that the one-dimensionality, which potentially is just a sort of 0 point emerging into this red spot, this point, this baby taking its first breath, and then two dimensions, where we go from this point, notice the pencil there, to the mother, the brother, the other, our first breath coming out of one dimension, and the first person we see, our frame of reference from now on, are these people gathered around us, apart from perhaps the midwife. And so what does that mean? It means that the base chakra and the navel chakra are completely associated with grounding and relationships, and they somehow are connected with this subconscious activity. Okay, well, you're lost. I'm going to find you. Other aspects of the second dimension, as I mentioned, the navel, relationships, the subconscious, the emerging world. So yeah, well, we're still on a piece of paper, aren't we? Because one dimension is a dot. Your mother, your brother, they're all lines going around in a circle. It's not real yet, but it becomes real when we imagine, and of course, very simple science, 3D equals space. You know, this stuff that we're in now, not just a piece of paper, 2D, but this real space, so it's got height now, is the terrain in which we exist. And importantly, our lower three, now the solar plexus and that earthing vortex on the bottom of that toroid, and the umbilicus between us and all these other family members, the relationships, yeah? So what I'm saying is that our lower three chakras subconsciously manifest us comfortably in this place we call space. That's all I'm saying. But it gets juicy now, because space on its own is like frozen, isn't it? It's just frozen. It becomes animated when we introduce time. And so that's why in science we talk about the space-time continuum. Okay, now before I go from this slide, the material world, well, of course it is, because it's now space. It's now our houses, our stuff that all fills up in space. Okay, so fourth dimension. If you've got the speakers on the right and you can't see all these fellows on their surfboards, move them over to the other side, because this picture really is important. And actually, I've got another version of it, so I'll show that as well. But it's important because it really describes what I'm trying to say right now, which is that from an esoteric perspective, the lower three chakras, and from now, let's call it an integrative scientific perspective, the lower three energy centers, chakras, the solar plexus, the navel, and the base vortex, these three centers pin us and hold us into space. Now that means that this one, the heart center, the what else do they call it? The assemblage point, the heart chakra, is somehow related to time. Now let's look at that. When the Greeks used to measure the pulse, by the way, a couple of thousand years ago, when we first started doing this kind of medicine, our hearts beat at 60 beats a minute. You know, just now we're in a rush, we're all TikTok in a rush. Whereas in a couple of thousand years ago, it made sense what I'm actually saying. But the heart is the clock, okay? So we're experiencing this dimension that we consider as time, TikTok, we experience it with this equipment activated, okay? So the heart and its vortex, and of course the lower three, which are keeping us in space, then becomes a bit like the surfer, okay? So what are these guys doing? They're not surfing on the sea, are they? No, this is a bore. This is a tidal bore. The moon does something, and then, you know, River Severn, several other places, this thing comes in. And so I'm not talking about the waves crashing on the beach. I'm talking about this wave that we call time. And when an individual, a human being, is present, they're on this, they're settled on this board. Okay, I'm calling the board the lower three chakras because that's the equipment we need to keep the body from falling over and doing stupid things. That lower three chakras manifest us in space, and the fourth chakra, the heart center, manifests us in time. So the image of an individual standing on a surfboard, riding this wave, which importantly is not on the beach, but it's a wave down the river of consciousness. Now, it's important. If we're stuck in the past, dragging anchors, we're going to come off the board. If we're throwing tentacles and filling filofaxes and our diaries, we're going to fall off the board in front. I'm talking about present, being present. I'm talking about Kundalini here. I hope you get that. So I'm talking about how effectively the lower three centers manifest our reality in space, and our heart chakra allows us to experience it in the present, in this cascade of ever happening nows, which is us riding that wave. We can fall off it, but we can climb back on again. It's like Kundalini's there with you sometimes and you're totally present, and sometimes she likes to coil back up and go to sleep because you've fallen off your board. Okay, how and why is this all significant? Because we have a sports gearbox. Now, I know we have a sports gearbox that is beyond what modern science allows us to understand with a space-time human being that lasts 4 score years and 10, is it? 3 score years and 10, pardon me. And it's been taboo. It's been a taboo subject. And that's why, even though I'm a scientist who could be sitting here telling you about all the research I've been doing, I'm telling you about it like this, because I can only do this because I've done all the research. But then I'm hoping you'll check for yourself. So the sports gearbox. Well, let me start by saying that I did a lot of research into distant healing. We mentioned earlier clairvoyance. Well, there are 5 pillars of parapsychology: telekinesis, precognition, remote viewing, distant healing, and clairvoyance. So they've all been well studied. I'm glad to say that there are people reawakening this research around the world formally. And I'm really glad to hear about these guys in Greenwich, because I think that's brilliant. I'm from Blighty. I'd love to come over and show you how all this equipment works. But the point is that when you do a distant healing study and you're filming a whole load of people's biofields, what someone is doing several thousand miles away is sending healing to these people, and we're observing it. And when 10 out of 10 all go pow and improve enormously, let's say, because their symmetry improves, the tensegrity of their biofield improves, and then, of course, the whole point about healing is this paradigm shift, this kind of phase shift we call healing, occurs in 2 parts. This tensegrity, the biofield, it's like your tent. If your tent's not put up right, it can't handle the wind. if your biofield's not symmetrical, if the toroid is not correct, it can't shine. So it's dimmed. So if you get the symmetry right and you spin the torsion field to the right pace, then it can brighten again. That's what we call healing. So we were doing this distant healing study, and of course, fundamentally, it's happening beyond space and time, because he's 7,000 miles away and we've got clocks lined up, bing, bang, bong, it's all happening instantly. How's that possible? How is that possible? Well, it's possible because the healer is using this toolkit that I'm sure other colleagues are going to be describing in this conference, which is not being currently utilized to maintain our experience of presence in space and time. And that equipment is the throat center, the brow center, what we call the third eye in certain circles, and then what we call the crown here. And healers, what they're doing is they've learned how to do it, like you with your Golf GTI suddenly learned how to use your sports gearbox. They've learned how to do this triage between this communication, this intention, and this source, this, let's call it divinity, why not, light if you like. Those three form the equipment required to work beyond space and time, i.e. do distant healing or move things around or do remote viewing or astral projection or whatever else it is you want to do. And right now, of course, because we're experiencing that point of singularity, it's like the emperor suddenly wears no clothes and we all have to face ourselves as we really are. And there's a shortcut to healing, which is claiming it, or we can get all gnarly and have to go do 40 days in the desert, whatever it takes, but let's go for it. So the fifth dimension relates obviously to each of the different elements. Here we are now at ether. I perhaps haven't touched on that aspect of the slide. I can only go forwards anyway. So yeah, the throat chakra, of course, you know, from my perspective, I'm looking at this space all the time, and when there's all kinds of shielding in front of it, we don't call it blocked energy because we honor the person whose energy it is, and they're doing it. So it's like, okay, well, they've got their shields up. I wonder why. The energy is congested, but they may be doing it on purpose, and you need to know why. So there are all kinds of patterns and symmetrical issues that can happen in this area. So it's, is that person really able to speak their truth with the people they're with, or do they feel heard, for example? These are very important kind of aspects of being, I suppose, feeling nurtured. And now, of course, having alluded to the sports gearbox, this third eye part of it, well, it's a kind of spiritual spirit level, the third eye and the crown. They sort of play this incredible color matrix game between the pineal and the pituitary gland, both of which are very responsible for opening the other energy centers through the hormones. I'm glad to say that there's such sciences as psychoneuroimmunology, which are kind of building the bridge between our knowledge of the energy centers from a biophotonic perspective and their knowledge from the chemistry perspective, the biochemistry, the hormones. And of course, it would be a lot more helpful if we weren't talking about ourselves, because when you look at plants, you have the buds and the petals on the same page, no problem. But with us, it does seem to be a problem. But anyhow, c'est la vie. The crown, well, that's such an interesting center. I do like to talk about it in terms of perhaps what terms you might have heard already. One of them being the silver thread or the silver cord, it's sometimes alluded to. Well, I think clearly when someone's having a Kundalini experience, the silver thread becomes more like a kind of pipe, a sort of huge cone of openness. And so the torsion vehicle, a sort of Merkaba that's constantly here, and we obviously can feel, but we don't see it because our eyes have had the blackboard, pencil, blackboard, pencil, blackboard, pencil kind of conditioning in our early kind of sighthood. Now we've got to, I mean, seeing energy is really easy if you want to practice. You just have a look and and you actually see it with a bit of practice. So I need to honor time. As far as I'm concerned, I've got like a couple of minutes. Those are the deadly sins and their colors. Obviously, they're heavenly virtues too. Just an idea of the kind of place you can look. Our technology is eminently accessible. I'm going to share a slide when I finish here so that someone can take an image of themselves, whatever it's like right now, either just their face or their whole body. It's a very private experience. You can ask a friend to hold the camera for you, the phone, whatever it is, the iPad, and then try something. You know, one of the things that's incredible about studying people is the group that is the random group who aren't necessarily experts at meditation or healing or whatever it is that you have in your study. They kick ass after a week. So what I'm trying to say is that just try something, just start something, whether it's Tai Chi in the park or, you know, conscious breathing, whatever it is, but try something and you'll be amazed how quickly your field, the tensegrity and symmetry improves. And then of course, the amplitude of the light can improve. So yeah, what to say, there it is, there's that access. So if you just type in now or take a photo of this page with your phone, and you can type it in later, hugeaura.com, soul mirror, and then your username is SM and your password is SM, and we're going to leave that sort of portal to you seeing your own biofield open for as long as you like, really. Have fun.